What if Issei was son of Ophis and Great Red and got pregnant Rias Akeno and Koneko? The night Issei Hayate died, it rained. Not the polite, cinematic kind of rain that falls softly on tragedy and makes everything feel meaningful. This was the aggressive, indifferent kind, cold sheets of water hammering the empty lot behind the old shrine, soaking into the earth, filling the silence between lightning strikes with a roar that made it impossible to hear yourself think. Which was fine. Issei wasn't thinking. Issei was busy dying. The spear of light had gone through the left side of his chest. Rainier, the girl who'd called herself Yuma, who'd worn a brown school uniform and a shy smile and agreed to go on a date with him like it was the most natural thing in the world, stood above him with her dark wings spread wide against the storm. Her expression had moved past cruelty into something more efficient. Indifferent. The look of someone completing a task. Sacred gear users are such a nuisance, she said, pulling the spear back. But you were never anything special, Issei Hayate. You were just in the way. He wanted to argue. He had, in fact, a considerable number of arguments prepared, most of them extremely rude, several anatomically ambitious. But the problem with a hole in your chest is that it makes rhetoric difficult. He could feel the cold getting louder. Not the rain. Something underneath it. A cold that didn't have a temperature, that was more like an absence, creeping up from his feet toward the place behind his sternum where something had always been warm. Don't, he thought, without knowing who he was talking to. His left arm was burning. Not pain. He was already past pain. Burning the way the word actually means. Light and heat, something luminous and furious moving under his skin from wrist to shoulder to chest, tracing lines he couldn't see, filling the cold absence like water rushing into a cracked vessel. The sacred gear on his arm, the boosted gear, the gauntlet of the Red Dragon Emperor, prison and power and legacy of the Welsh Dragon Drake, was glowing. But not its usual green. Not its usual anything. It was glowing red and black. Red like the Great Red, the Apocalypse Dragon, the dream dragon that swam through the dimensional gap between worlds like it owned them. Because it did. Black like Ophis. The infinite dragon god. The dragon of infinity and Ouroboros. The thing that had looked at the entire structure of reality, and found it mildly inconvenient. Rainier took a step back. For the first time, she looked uncertain. What, boost? The word came out of the boosted gear like it always did. That deep, resonant voice of Drake, the Welsh dragon, speaking from inside the gem. But there was something wrong with the sound. It was layered. Underneath Drake's voice, like a harmony in a chord, was something else. Two something elses, vast and unstructured, that didn't use human language at all. One was coiled infinity. One was the feeling of standing in the first sunlight of the first morning that ever existed. The light exploded outward from Issei's chest. Rainier screamed. Then she was gone. Not dead, just gone, blasted backward through the rain until she hit the shrine wall and slid down it and lay very still. The light continued for another 3 seconds, illuminating every raindrop in a 300-meter radius, turning the empty lot into something briefly sacred. Then it folded back in, collapsing to a point at the center of Issei's chest, and went quiet. The rain kept falling. Issei lay on his back and breathed. This was notable primarily because, by any reasonable medical assessment, he should not have been able to do that. The spear had gone through him. He'd felt his lung deflate. He'd felt things stop that were not supposed to stop. He'd felt the cold getting louder, and he'd understood, with the particular clarity that dying sometimes grants, that this was it. This was the end of Issei Hayate, pervert, teenage boy, sacred gear user, virgin, son. Instead, he was breathing. He raised his left arm and looked at the boosted gear. The green gem blinked at him. Around the edges of it, barely visible, was a tracery of black that he had never seen before, like a circuit diagram drawn in shadow, elegant and infinite, that pulsed once and then faded. Partner, said Drake, and his voice was very careful. I have many things to tell you. But perhaps not tonight. Yeah, Issei said to the rain. Probably not tonight. He walked home. This seemed insane. He had been stabbed through the chest. He was soaking wet. It was past midnight. He walked home anyway, because the alternative was staying in that lot, and he found he had very limited desire to do that. His chest ached with a deep, Structural ache, the kind that isn't quite pain anymore but is the memory of pain, a geological record of damage that had somehow been undone. His shirt had a hole in it. Through the hole, he could see unbroken skin. His mother was asleep. His father was asleep. His little brother Kiba's door. Wait, no. He didn't have a brother named Kiba. He was thinking of someone else. He was alone in his house and he climbed the stairs and fell face first onto his bed without removing his wet clothes, and he thought, I should be dead. He thought, something happened. He thought, what am I? Sleep came anyway, because the body is pragmatic even when the mind is having an existential crisis. He slept without dreaming, or if he dreamed of being very large, and of flying between the walls of a place that had no walls, and of a feeling like being the whole sky. In the morning, there was a girl sitting on his windowsill. Issei had been awakened by the light through the curtains. He rolled over, squinted at the clock, 7:14 a.m., and then looked at the window and found himself facing a girl in a black dress who was watching him with eyes the color of an empty sky. Purple. Still, like a lake in winter that has forgotten it was ever moving. She was small. She looked young, maybe 12, maybe 13, in the way that some things look young because they have decided to look young rather than because time has made them that way. Her hair was black and straight, and fell past her waist. She sat on the windowsill with her legs crossed and her hands folded in her lap, and she looked at him with those infinite eyes and said nothing. Issei said, with the eloquence that distinguished him in social situations, Huh? You survived, the girl said. Her voice was flat. Not unfriendly, just uninflected, like a statement of fact delivered by something that had never seen the need to perform emotion. I was watching. I wanted to see. You were. Issei sat up. His chest ached. Outside his window, which was on the second floor, there was no ladder, no tree, no reasonable way for a person to be sitting where she was sitting. Who are you? The girl looked at him for a moment. Ophis, she said. The word hit him the way words sometimes do when they carry too much weight, not with sound but with impact, a compression of the air around them. He didn't know why. He had no reason to recognize the name. He was a 16-year-old boy who had never been involved in the supernatural world, who had only yesterday discovered that angels were real and also cruel, and also had really good spears. He had no context for that name, and yet, something in his chest, in that deep structural place where the warmth lived, where the light had come from last night, recognized it. Recognized her. Not the way you recognize a face. The way you recognize a sound you heard before you were born. Oh, he said. You carry both of us, Ophis said. She hadn't moved. She was still watching him with that lake-still gaze. That is unusual. We did not plan it. Both of you, Issei repeated. Great Red. Myself. A pause, as if she was deciding whether to continue and then determining that she had already started so she might as well. We are not usually capable of producing life. We are too different. The infinite and the flame of creation. One expands without limit. One burns and renews. They should cancel. Another pause. You are the evidence that they did not. Issei stared at her. You're saying, he said slowly, that you're my mother. Ophis considered the word mother the way you might consider an unfamiliar tool, trying to understand its function, its weight, whether it was the right word for the job. I don't know what that means, she said finally. Not the way you mean it. I did not raise you. I did not choose to make you. You were not made. She tilted her head very slightly. You happened, between the dimensional gap and the boundary of the existing world, at a point where Great Red and I came into contact for the first and only time. You were a consequence. A consequence, Issei said. Yes, that's, he tried to find the word. That's a terrible thing to call a person. Ophis blinked. It seemed, from her expression, that she was genuinely trying to understand why. You exist, she said. You are here. Last night you should have died and you did not, because what you carry cannot die easily. Your existence is fact. The cause of your existence is also fact. A small pause. I don't understand why the word matters. Issei looked at this girl, this entity, this impossible ancient thing wearing a child's face, and felt something complicated. He was, at his core, a straightforward person. He liked girls, he liked his friends. He wanted to be strong, to protect people, to not be useless. He did not typically navigate existential revelations before breakfast. "Where's Great Red?" he asked. For the first time, something moved in Ophis's expression. It wasn't warmth, it was too alien for warmth, but it was something. Acknowledgement, maybe? Recognition that this was a more interesting question than she'd expected. "In the dimensional gap," she said. "He is always there. He cannot come here easily. The world is too small for him." A pause. "But you can feel him." Issei opened his mouth to say that he couldn't, and stopped. Because he could. He'd thought it was his heartbeat. That steady, deep, warm pulse behind his sternum that he'd always assumed was just his heart doing its job. He'd thought it was normal. But now, paying attention to it, really paying attention, he could feel the difference between his actual heartbeat and this other thing. His heartbeat was biological. Rhythmic. Temporal. This was vast. This pulsed on a scale that made heartbeats seem like suggestions. This was warm the way a star is warm, not body heat, not comfort warmth, but something that generates, something fundamentally incapable of cold because it is the source of light itself. It lived in him the way a river lives in a valley. It had always been there, carving him into the shape he was, and he had simply never stopped to wonder what the sound of water meant. "Oh," he said softly. "Oh, that's—" "Yes," said Ophis. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, Issei could hear the neighborhood waking up, a car, a bird, the distant sound of someone's television. The perfectly ordinary machinery of a perfectly ordinary morning that had no idea what was sitting on this windowsill, and what was pulsing in this boy's chest. "What do I do?" Issei asked. Ophis looked at him. "Live," she said. "You have already survived something that should have killed you. This is sufficient progress for a single night." He went to school. This was, he recognized, not the most logical response to discovering that he was the accidental offspring of the two most powerful dragons in existence, and had died and undead in a rainstorm the previous evening. But he didn't know what else to do, and doing nothing felt worse than doing something mundane, and school was the most mundane thing available to him. He sat in class. He could not retain any information about the lesson. Matsuda and Motohama were complaining about something, a girl who'd rejected them, or possibly the same girl rejecting both of them, or possibly the collective intransigence of girls as a category. It was difficult to tell because they were talking over each other. Issei contributed appropriate responses at what seemed like appropriate intervals while internally he was doing something that he would not have called panicking because Issei Hayate did not panic, but which was adjacent to panicking in the way that a thunderstorm is adjacent to a light drizzle. He was the son of Ophis and Great Red. He had a sacred gear that should have been a prison for a dragon that was now carrying something else, something that had helped him survive last night, that had rewritten the light coming out of the gem from green to that layered red-black that he couldn't stop seeing when he closed his eyes. He had been killed and come back, and the coming back had been involuntary. He had two mothers, no, one mother and one father, except that neither of them were human parents, neither of them had been present. And the one who'd visited him this morning had said he was a consequence in the tone of voice you'd used to describe a math result. And yet she'd come. She'd sat on his windowsill in the early morning and she'd watched him with those still, infinite eyes and she'd said you survived as if that fact was worth saying, as if she needed to hear it confirmed. As if, he stopped that thought. He was 16. He was not equipped to psychoanalyze the dragon of infinity before third period. Rias Akeno found him after school. He'd been avoiding the walk home that would take him past the old shrine, which was irrational because Rainier was presumably still unconscious against the wall somewhere, and not lying in wait. But irrationality was available to him today, and he decided to use it. He was sitting on the steps behind the gymnasium, turning the boosted gear over in his mind, trying to understand what had changed, when her shadow fell across him. He looked up. She was extraordinary. This was not a new observation. Rias Akeno was the kind of person whose extraordinary quality preceded her into rooms, announced itself before she arrived, lingered after she left. Crimson hair catching the afternoon light like something on fire. Blue-green eyes the exact color of deep water. The easy, unconscious authority of someone who has always known that what they are is significant. But today she looked different. Today she looked, he searched for the word uncertain. Not afraid. Not confused. Uncertain in the specific way of someone who has done extensive calculations and arrived at a result they didn't expect and are not sure how to account for it. Sit with me, she said. It wasn't a question. Rias Gremory didn't really do questions. But it was gentler than a command, it was an invitation with an assumption. The tone of someone who expected to be accepted because she was genuinely curious about the answer rather than because she was entitled to it. He sat. She sat next to him. For a moment, neither of them said anything. I was there last night, she said finally. After Rainier. I arrived after. A small pause. I had planned to reincarnate you. Reincarnate me? Yes. It's a system, evil pieces, used to bring humans with exceptional potential into a devil's peerage. I carry a set. When I found you, you were, she stopped. You should have been dead, Issei Hayadu. You were clinically dead by any measurement. But the evil pieces wouldn't work on you. The pawn pieces, she looked at her hands. They're supposed to be absorbed. They found nothing to hold on to. It was as if. She searched for the word. As if you were already full. As if every piece of you was already accounted for. Issei said nothing. What are you? She asked. It wasn't rude. It was the most genuine question he'd been asked in recent memory, stripped of performance, stripped of strategy. Just a person sitting in afternoon light asking another person what they fundamentally were because she needed to know. He considered, for approximately 4 seconds, whether to lie. Then he told her. Not all of it. He didn't have all of it himself yet, and what he did have was unstructured, more impression than information. But he told her about Ophis. He told her about the pulse behind his sternum. He told her about the light that had come out of him last night, the way it had felt like something old and vast and furious rising to defend something it considered its own. He told her about the boosted gear looking different, about Drake saying I have many things to tell you in a voice that was very careful. He watched her face while he talked. He wasn't good at reading people, or he'd always assumed he wasn't, but her face was doing something interesting while he spoke. The calculation dissolving, the certainty reforming into something larger. Her eyes doing that thing that eyes do when information arrives that changes the size of the world they'd been seeing. Son of Ophis and Great Red, she said quietly. So she says? She was on your windowsill this morning. Yeah. Rias was quiet for a long moment. The afternoon settled around them, shadows lengthening, first hints of evening chill, somewhere on the sports field someone shouting encouragement at a practice. I still want you in my club, she said. Your club. The Occult Research Club. Which is, a slight pause, which might have been something like embarrassment. Not entirely about research. I have a peerage, and we handle devil-related business in this territory, and I would, she stopped and reconstructed. I'm not asking you because I want to use you. I want that to be clear. I'm asking because what you are is extraordinary and because extraordinary things tend to attract exactly the kind of danger you encountered last night, and because, another stop. This one longer. When she spoke again, her voice was slightly different. And because I find that I'm curious about you in a way that I can't quite explain, and I've learned to trust that feeling when it occurs. Issei looked at her. In his chest, the great red pulse kept its vast, unhurried rhythm. Okay, he said. Rias looked at him. Okay, yeah. Okay, I'll join your club. He shrugged, with the studied casualness of someone who was doing anything other than feeling an enormous, terrifying relief. I mean, I've got a lot of questions and approximately 0 people to ask. You probably know more about this stuff than I do. I know considerably more about this than you do, right? So. He put his hands on his knees. When do we start? The Occult Research Club room was on the top floor of the old school building. It smelled like old books and something faintly floral, overlaid with the cool stone and shadow smell of a room that was older than the building containing it, or had been something else before it was this. There was a large couch, a fireplace, bookshelves that were organized in some system that made sense to someone who wasn't Issei, a table that had seen better centuries, and a tea service that was genuinely and sincerely excellent, which he discovered when Himejima Akeno poured him a cup 5 minutes after he arrived. Akeno. He had seen her before, of course. Everybody had seen her. She was roughly as subtle as a sunrise, but he had not been in a room with her, not at this distance. She moved like she was composing music with her body, every gesture considered, unhurried, precisely calibrated to the exact amount of impact she wanted it to have. She was smiling at him when she handed him the tea. The smile was layered, surface warmth above something else, something more electric and interested that she was choosing, consciously, not to bring fully to the surface. "Welcome," she said. "Rias has told us a little about you. Good things, hopefully." "Interesting things," Akeno corrected, and her smile did something small and private. Koneko toujours was in the corner with a book. She looked at him from over the cover when he came in. Her eyes were goldish. Her expression was neutral in the specific way that doesn't mean the absence of thought but the presence of a great deal of thought being given no external outlet. She looked at him for 3 full seconds, then went back to her book. But before she did, he caught it, barely, in the fraction of a second before her gaze dropped. Something shifted in her expression. Not fear. Not exactly. More like the look you get when you're walking in the dark and your foot finds a step where you expected flat ground. A sudden awareness of depth. He sat on the couch. He drank his tea. Rias sat across from him in what was clearly her chair, the one that faced the room, the one that had been arranged to face the room, the one that was sized and positioned to make clear who this space belonged to. She looked at him over her own cup. "We'll start with basics," she said. "Devil's Society. The system of evil pieces and peerages. The faction structure. Sacred gears, though in your case, yours appears to be." She paused. "Different," said Akeno, from the window. "Different," Rias agreed. "We'll need to understand what it's doing now." "Drake is still in there," Issei said. "He talked to me last night. He said he had things to explain." "The Welsh dragon." Rias set down her cup. "Drake and the vanishing dragon Albedo, the 2 heavenly dragons, have been sealed in sacred gears for millennia. The boosted gear and the divine dividing. Drake in yours?" She looked at his left arm. "But if what you're saying is accurate, then the boosted gear isn't only Drake anymore. What you carry has changed it." From the corner, without looking up from her book, Koneko said, "It's not just the sacred gear." Everyone looked at her. She closed the book, set it in her lap, and looked at Issei with those gold eyes that were doing complex, unhurried mathematics. "I can sense senjutsu. Natural energy. The way it moves and what it moves through." A small pause. "When he walked in, I felt," she stopped. Tried again. "It's like standing at the edge of something. Not in a bad way. Like standing at the edge of the ocean at night when you can't see where the water ends. You just know there's more. A lot more. Going very far down." The room was quiet. "That's the most words I've heard you say at once," Akeno said, with something that sounded like genuine surprise. Koneko looked at her. It seemed relevant. Issei looked at his hands. The boosted gear was quiet now, the green gem sitting in the knuckle of the gauntlet, doing nothing, waiting. Patient as a held breath. Under his sternum, the great red pulse continued its vast, warm, unhurried beat. "Partner," said Drake, quietly, from inside the gem. Just that. Partner. Like an acknowledgement. Or maybe like the beginning of a sentence that he was going to take his time completing. "I have no idea what I'm doing," Issei said, which was true. "No," Rias agreed, and something in her expression was warm and decided, like a fire that has found its fuel. "But we're going to find out. Together." He looked at her. He looked at Akeno, watching from the window with that electric, layered smile. He looked at Koneko, sitting in her corner with her book and her accurate, unnerving assessment of the ocean inside him. He thought, "I should have died last night." He thought, "But I didn't." He thought, "I wonder if this is what it was supposed to feel like all along." Outside, the evening settled over Ko Town. The street lights came on. Students went home. The world went about its entirely ordinary business, entirely unaware that in the old building on the top floor, 4 people were sitting in a circle of lamplight, 1 impossibly ancient boy who didn't know it yet, and 3 girls who were, in their entirely different ways, beginning to understand exactly how deep the water went. In the dimensional gap between worlds, something vast and red and warm turned in its sleep and felt, for the first time in a very long time, something that could only be described as satisfied. On a windowsill across town, a girl was still. Infinite eyes looked at the moon and said nothing. Which, for her, was how contentment looked. She came back the next morning, and the morning after that. By the third morning, Issei had stopped being startled by the small dark-haired figure on his windowsill, and had started leaving the window unlatched the night before, which felt like a significant psychological development that he chose not to examine too closely. On the fourth morning he made 2 cups of tea, one for himself, one set on the windowsill beside her, and watched her look at it for a long moment with the expression of someone encountering an object whose function they understand intellectually but have never had personal occasion to use. She picked it up. She drank from it. She didn't say anything about it. But she came back the 5th morning, and when she arrived the cup was already there, and something in the way she settled onto the sill was marginally less rigid than before. Infinitesimally. If you weren't paying close attention you would have missed it entirely. Issei was paying close attention. He didn't know when that had started, the paying close attention to Ophis. It might have been from the beginning, from that first morning when he rolled over and found Infinity sitting in his window frame and had felt, underneath the shock and the confusion and the very reasonable existential terror, something else. Something that he didn't have a clean word for. Recognition, maybe, except that wasn't quite right because you couldn't recognize something you'd never seen. It was more like the feeling when a song resolves, when a chord that has been unfinished for 4 measures finally finds its note, and something in your chest releases without you knowing it had been held. She was strange. She was ancient and alien and fundamentally other in ways that made talking to her feel like trying to have a conversation with a very still lake. There was depth, certainly enormous depth, but the surface gave almost nothing back. She used words economically, chose them with a precision that suggested she found most of them unnecessary. She looked at everything with that purple, winter-lake gaze as though she was continuously deciding whether to be interested in it, and continuously arriving at a verdict of insufficient data, continue observing. But she came back every morning. And she drank the tea. And on the 5th morning she said, without preamble and without looking away from the window, "Ask what you want to ask." Issei wrapped both hands around his cup. "How did it happen?" Ophis was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone deciding whether to answer, more like someone translating something from a language that didn't map cleanly onto human words. "The dimensional gap," she said finally, "is not a place. It is an absence. The space between dimensions, between every world that exists and every world that doesn't, where nothing is stable enough to be real. I live there. Great Red lives there." A pause. "We have coexisted in the gap for longer than most things in this universe have been alive. We are not compatible. Infinite and creative. The fundamental nature of Ophis is to compress, to coil, to seek stillness. The fundamental nature of Great Red is to expand, to burn, to fill everything available to him with the fact of his existence." Her voice remained flat, informational. "We avoid each other. Usually, Issei said. "There was an incident," Ophis said. Something moved in her expression, not embarrassment, not quite, but the closest thing to it that was available to her face. "I was pursuing the quiet I have always sought. Great Red exists in the place I need to be to find it. He is loud. His very existence is loud. He takes up space that I need to be empty." A small pause. I approached him. I intended to tell him to move. Issei stared at her. "You tried to tell the Great Red Dragon to move?" "Yes." "Did he?" Ophis looked at him with those still eyes. "No," she said, in a tone that suggested this had been approximately as surprising to her as it was to Issei. "He found it." The pause this time was longer, more complicated, as if she was excavating a memory that had been filed somewhere she didn't often access. "He found it funny." He laughed. "You cannot imagine what it is like when Great Red laughs. It is like, imagine every sunrise that has ever happened, happening simultaneously. That is approximately the sound." Issei could feel it, actually, that warm pulse in his chest doing something slightly different when she said it, brightening by a fraction, as if in agreement or recognition. "What happened then?" he asked quietly. "We were in proximity," Ophis said. "For one moment. We touched. Not physically. We don't have, there is no physical in the gap, not the way you mean it. But we touched. Existence to existence, infinite and flame. A pause so long that Issei thought she'd decided to stop, and then, you were the result. The morning light was doing quiet things to the room. Downstairs he could hear his parents moving around, the sounds of a household getting ready for an ordinary day. Above that, deeper than it, the great red pulse kept its ancient rhythm. He thought about two impossible things colliding in the space between worlds, one that wanted silence, one that was constitutionally incapable of it, and somehow, impossibly, producing something small enough to fit in a human body. Where did I go? He asked. After. How did I end up here? We did not know what you were, at first, Ophis said. You were small. An extremely small thing that was also, somehow, the coexistence of two things that should not coexist. You destabilized a portion of the gap. For just a moment, something that might have been dry, ancient humor moved through her voice. You were very loud. Immediately, Issei felt the corners of his mouth do something involuntary. Sorry, you were an infant. You could not be held responsible. Ophis looked out the window. Great Red carried you to the boundary. To where the gap meets the existing world. He left you there, at the edge of a world that was small enough for you to live in. Another pause. A human couple found you. We observed until we were certain you were. She stopped. Safe? Issei offered. Yes, Ophis said. The word came out slightly differently than her other words. Not softer, she didn't do soft, but more deliberate, as if she was choosing it very precisely and wanted it to land in the right place. Until we were certain you were safe. The silence that followed was companionable in a way that earlier silences between them hadn't been. Issei sat with it and let it exist and thought about his parents, his actual parents, the ones downstairs making breakfast, the ones who had found a baby at the edge of nowhere, and taken him home without knowing what he was. He thought about how ordinary they were, how consistently, stubbornly, beautifully ordinary, his dad's terrible jokes, his mom's excessive collection of houseplants, the particular warmth of that house that had nothing to do with dragons or sacred gears or the dimensional gap. They're good people, he said. My parents. The ones who raised me. Ophis looked at him. That was not an accident, she said. We were careful about that. He told Rias that afternoon. They were in the club room, just the two of them for the first hour, before Akeno arrived with tea and Koneko arrived with her book, and the particular charged quiet that the four of them seemed to generate together settled over the space. Rias listened to him recount the morning's conversation with the complete, focused attention that was, he was learning, her default mode for things she considered important. She didn't interrupt. She didn't write anything down. She just listened, and he could see her processing it in real time, the slight movements of her expression, the way her eyes tracked something invisible as connections formed. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Ophis watched over you, she said. All these years, I guess. That's, she stopped. Started again with a different angle. You have to understand what Ophis is. Not who, what. She is the dragon of infinity. The Ouroboros dragon. She has existed since before most of the things in this universe had names. Her power is something that the entire structure of faction politics, devil, angel, fallen angel, every group with a stake in the way things are, orbits around like planets around a sun, because everyone is either trying to court her or trying to avoid her. She doesn't involve herself in anything. She has one goal and one interest, and they are both the same thing, the quiet of the dimensional gap, which Great Red's presence prevents her from accessing. Rias's voice was level, precise, informational, and she spent 16 years visiting a window in a suburban house in Coat Town to make sure you were safe. Issei looked at his hands. Yeah, he said. That means something, Rias said. Not gently, she wasn't performing gentleness for him, she wasn't managing him. She was just stating what seemed to her to be an evident fact. Whatever she told you about not knowing what mother means, whatever she said about you being a consequence, that means something, Issei. He didn't respond. The great red pulse was steady and warm in his chest, and he pressed his hand over it briefly without meaning to, a small, automatic gesture, like checking that something is still there. Rias saw it. He could tell she saw it by the way her expression changed slightly. She didn't comment on it, which he was grateful for. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes. The evil piece is not working on me, he said. What does that actually mean? I know you said I was already full, but it means your existence is already classified, Rias said. Evil pieces work by finding the incomplete places in a person, the places where potential exists but hasn't been filled yet, and filling them with devil energy, rewriting them. It's intrusive by nature. It requires something to work on. She looked at him with those sea-deep eyes. There was nothing to work on. Not because you had no potential, the opposite, because everything in you is already spoken for. Every piece of what you are already carries something. Drake's legacy. Great Red's flame. Ophis's infinity. A pause. Trying to rewrite you with evil pieces would be like trying to paint over the sun. Issei processed this. That's a very flattering metaphor, he said. It's an accurate one. She said it without inflection, not a compliment, just a fact, delivered with the same weight she gave all facts. I'm not in the habit of flattery, he believed her. That was the thing about Rias Akeno. She was many things, and he was still learning most of them. But he was already certain that she was not in the habit of saying things she didn't mean. There was an integrity to the way she spoke that ran bone deep, that had nothing to do with performance. She said what she believed, and she believed what she said, and the two things were the same, and that was that. It was, he thought, one of the more remarkable things about her. The door opened and Akeno arrived with a tray, and the afternoon shifted into its habitual rhythm, and Issei sat in the middle of it, and felt the great red pulse and thought about a small thing that was also the coexistence of two impossible things, crying loudly in the space between worlds, while something vast and warm and amused carried it to the edge of a world small enough to hold it. A week into his membership in the Occult Research Club, Koneko came to find him. Not in the club room, she found him in the school library, which he used approximately once a semester under normal circumstances, but had been frequenting lately because it had books about supernatural history, and Rias had given him a reading list that was aggressively ambitious. He was working through a volume on dragon taxonomy that was denser than it had any right to be when he became aware of someone standing 3 feet to his left. He looked up. Koneko looked at him with those gold eyes. She was carrying a book. She always seemed to be carrying a book, and she had the look of someone who had made a decision and was implementing it before she could reconsider. Sit with me? He asked. She sat. Not next to him, across from him, on the other side of the table, with the width of the table between them. She opened her book. He went back to dragon taxonomy. For 5 minutes neither of them said anything, and it was not uncomfortable. Then she said, without looking up, "You can feel him." He knew who she meant. Yeah. What does it feel like? He thought about it. Warm, he said. Really warm. But not like a heater or a fire. More like, he searched for it. More like the feeling when you've been cold for a long time and then you step into sunlight. Not the warmth itself. The relief of the warmth. Koneko turned a page. And Ophis? I can't feel her the same way, he said. Not like a presence. It's more like, he stopped. You know how sometimes a room is very quiet, and you can't hear anything, and the silence has a quality to it? Like it's not just the absence of sound but an actual thing? She looked up from her book. Yes, she said. Like that, he said. Somewhere at the very back of me. Not warm. Just still. Very still. Like something that has always been there, and will always be there, and is entirely comfortable with that fact. Koneko looked at him for a moment with those complicated gold eyes. Then she looked back at her book. I can sense it, she said quietly. From the outside. When I'm near you. Senjutsu reads natural energy. The energy of living things, of the world, of the space between things. What you carry is a small pause. It's like trying to read the ocean. I can sense the surface of it. The surface alone is more than I've ever sensed from any single thing. But it keeps going. Much further than it should be able to go. She turned another page. It's not frightening, she added, in the tone of someone who had considered this carefully and arrived at a specific verdict. It should be frightening. Things that large usually are. But it isn't. Why isn't it? He asked. She was quiet for a moment. Because you're you, she said finally. And the simplicity of it, the complete, unadorned plainness of the statement, landed with more weight than a complicated answer would have. She said it the way she said everything, without performance, without softening, without any of the social machinery that most people wrapped around vulnerable statements to protect themselves. Just the fact, delivered directly. Issei looked at the table. "Thanks, Koneko," he said. She didn't respond. But she also didn't leave, and they sat in the library in their companionable non-silence for another hour. And when he finally gathered his books to go, she stood at the same time, and they walked back to the club room together. And she walked close enough that their arms were almost touching but not quite. And he thought about the ocean and about surfaces and about the things that existed below them that were large and still and not frightening because they were simply, fundamentally yours. 9 days after his death and resurrection, Ophis brought Great Red. This was not planned. Issei woke to the usual pre-dawn quiet, the usual latch already undone, and rolled over expecting the usual still figure on the windowsill, and found instead that the room was wrong. Not wrong in a threatening way. Wrong the way a room is wrong when something very large is contained in a space that is technically sufficient but not quite designed for it. Everything was slightly more itself than usual. The colors a fraction more saturated, the shadows a fraction deeper, the light from the street lamp outside doing something slightly excessive. The air had the quality of the air before a thunderstorm, but warmer. Much warmer. Ophis was on the windowsill. Next to her, which should not have been possible because next to her was a wall, was a presence. He couldn't see it. Not directly. When he tried to look at it directly, his eyes slid off it the way eyes slide off things that are too bright, not because it was blinding, but because it was too there, too densely present, in a way that the human visual system wasn't equipped to process. But in his peripheral vision, and in the space behind his sternum where the pulse lived, he could feel it exactly. Vast. Warm. Amused. The great red pulse in his chest, which was always there, always steady, was different now, resonant, the way a tuning fork resonates when you hold it next to its matching frequency. Not louder. Fuller. Like a word that has been spoken aloud after a long time of being only thought. "He wanted to see you," Ophis said. She was watching Issei with those still eyes. "I told him you were adequate. He wanted to see for himself." Issei sat up in his bed and looked at the thing in his peripheral vision that was too present to look at directly and said, in a voice that was steadier than he expected, "Hi." The warmth in the room intensified by a fraction. It was not like being spoken to. It was more like standing in a beam of light that had, for just a moment, been aimed specifically at you, not comfortable, not uncomfortable, but precise. Intentional. Something arrived in his chest that was not a word. It was bigger than a word. It was an impression, like Ophis had said, but not small. The impression of a thing that had watched him from an enormous distance for a very long time and had felt, at that distance, something that was the Great Red's version of what Issei would call pride. Not pride in him exactly. More like the pride of a fire that has made a flame. Not possession. Not ego. The satisfaction of something that generates, seeing generation continue. And underneath the pride, underneath it, vast and simple and undecorated, recognition. The recognition of a thing finding the piece of itself that had been walking around in the world, carrying its warmth, keeping it in a small protected place behind a human sternum. "Oh," Issei said softly. His eyes were doing something involuntary. He pressed the heel of his hand against them, hard, because Issei Hayate did not cry in front of ancient cosmic entities before the sun came up, even if one of them was technically his father. He breathed through it. The warmth in the room held steady around him, patient, unhurried. "Okay," he said, after a moment. "Okay." The presence in the room shifted, not leaving, but settling, becoming less active, as if Great Red had found what he came for and was now simply content to exist nearby for a while. The excessiveness of the colors gentled. The air kept its warmth. Ophis was still watching him. "He can't speak," she said. "Not in any language that works here. He communicates in," she paused. "Impressions. Large ones." "Yeah, I got that," Issei said. He took a breath. Does he do this? Come here? Often?" "No," Ophis said. "I do. He doesn't leave the gap easily. It requires," she paused, "effort. He doesn't usually find things that justify the effort." Issei was quiet for a moment. "He thinks I justify it?" Ophis looked at him with her still, unreadable eyes, and for just a moment, one fraction of a second gone before he could be certain he'd seen it. Something in her expression was not unreadable at all. It was simple and direct and entirely certain. Yes, she said. The warmth in the room kept its steady, enormous beat. He told Rias about it that afternoon. And Akeno, who had arrived mid-conversation and perched on the arm of the couch with her tea and listened with that electric, interested attention she brought to everything about him. And Koneko, who was in her corner and gave no sign of listening but who, when he finished, turned a page in her book and said without looking up, "He came to see if you were all right." Both of them do. In their ways. That's a remarkable thing, Akeno said softly. She was not performing softness for him. She did that sometimes, the performance, and it was beautiful and knowing and slightly dangerous, and he could tell the difference. This was real. Her voice was genuinely quiet. Two beings that size. Checking on a human teenager. She smiled, but it was different from her usual smile. Less layered, more direct. "You must be very important." "I'm really not," Issei said. "You're wrong," said Rias. She said it plainly, as was her habit. "You're wrong, and you'll understand that eventually, and in the meantime we'll keep telling you until you do." Issei looked at her. At Akeno, on the couch arm with her real smile. At Koneko in her corner with her open book. The great red pulse kept its ancient rhythm. Outside, the afternoon was doing its usual things. Light and shadow, the sounds of the school winding down, the first smells of evening filtering through the clubroom's high windows. Everything ordinary, everything exactly as it always was, except for the way Rias was looking at him, with those sea-deep eyes, with the expression of someone who has seen something extraordinary and has quietly, firmly decided to stand next to it. And the way Akeno was watching him over her teacup, with that current running under her surface that she was not, quite, bothering to hide. And the way Koneko's foot had shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, so that the toe of her shoe was touching the leg of the couch he was sitting on, small, deniable, present. He was 16 years old and he had died and come back and discovered that he was the impossible child of two impossible things, and he was sitting in a room that smelled like old books and good tea and something faintly floral. He had never felt less alone in his life. "Partner," said Drake, from the quiet boosted gear, in a voice that was warm in its own particular way, the warmth of something ancient and proud that has been waiting a very long time for things to start, becoming what they were always going to be. "I have many things to tell you, but perhaps," he added, "we can start tomorrow." The training ground was underground. This was one of several things about Devil Society that Issei was still adjusting to. The casual deployment of magic to solve problems that humans would have needed architecture for. Rias had opened a section of floor in the old school building's basement with a gesture so practiced it was barely a gesture, more like an afterthought, and beneath it was a space roughly the size of a professional soccer stadium that had no business being there by any law of physics Issei had ever been taught. Stone walls. High vaulted ceiling lost in shadow. The floor was worn smooth in patterns that suggested centuries of use, scorch marks, impact craters filled in and worn down again, the geological record of a lot of people hitting each other with supernatural force. It smelled like ozone and old stone and something metallic that Issei was choosing not to think too hard about. "This is where we train," Rias said. She was standing at the center of the space with her hands clasped behind her back, surveying it with the proprietary ease of someone entirely comfortable with the fact that they own a stadium. "Raiding games require preparation. We compete regularly against other peerages. It's part of Devil Society, political in function but structured as sport. Performance in raiding games affects status, territory, negotiation position." She looked at him. "You'll need to learn to fight." "I know how to fight," Issei said. Everyone in the room, Rias, Akeno, Koneko, and Yudokiba, who had arrived that morning and introduced himself with the kind of effortless good looks that Issei found both impressive and deeply unfair, looked at him. "You know how to throw a punch," Kiba said. He said it kindly, which somehow made it worse. "I threw a good punch at Rainier." "You were also dead at the time," Akeno observed. "Technically, Issei." Rias's voice was not unkind. It was simply precise. "What you have is extraordinary. What you know how to do with it is approximately nothing. We're going to change that." She gestured at the worn stone floor. "Start with something basic. Call the boosted gear. Let's see what it does now. Issei looked at his left arm. He'd been doing this privately, in his room, in the evenings, holding his arm out and willing the boosted gear to appear and then examining it in the lamplight, studying the changes. The gauntlet was the same shape it had always been, apparently, red scaled, the green gem in the knuckle, but the green gem had a vein of black through it now, like a crack except it wasn't a crack, more like a seam, like two things had been carefully joined. When he turned it in the light the black vein caught it differently, absorbing rather than reflecting. He called it now. The gauntlet materialized over his left arm with the sound, and there was always a sound, he'd realized. A deep resonant hum that Drake produced like a bell being struck, and he held it out for the room to see. Koneko had gone still in her corner. Akeno made a small sound. Not alarmed. Interested. Very interested. Rias stepped forward and looked at the boosted gear with the expression of a scholar encountering a primary source document in a language they'd been told doesn't exist. She reached out, stopped just short of touching it, reconsidered, and touched it. The gem pulsed once, green, then that layered red-black, then back to green, and Rias withdrew her hand quickly. Not hurt. Just startled. Drake, she said carefully, addressing the gem. Gremier, said Drake, from inside the gem. His voice filled the training ground in a way that wasn't about volume, it was about resonance, the stone walls doing something to the sound that made it seem to come from everywhere at once. I am aware that you have questions. They are reasonable questions. I will answer them when I have finished answering my partner's questions, which are considerable and ongoing. Fair, said Rias, and stepped back. Boost, Issei said. Boost, Drake confirmed. The power doubled. This was something he'd done before, theoretically, experimentally in his room, but doing it in a large stone space was different. The air pressure in the room shifted. The scorch marks on the floor nearest him brightened briefly, old burns re-illuminated by proximity to something that recognized what had made them. Issei felt the familiar compression and release of the boosted gear doing its thing, power accumulating like water behind a dam. Again, said Rias. Boost. Again. He could feel it now. The doubling was exponential, not additive, and after 2 boosts the weight of what he was carrying started to become noticeable. Not heavy, exactly. Present. The way gravity becomes noticeable when you're carrying something substantial. His left arm felt warmer than the rest of him. Again, said Rias. Boost. 3. The air around him was doing something. He could see it, a distortion, heat haze but not heat, more like a density difference. A column of altered space centered on his arm and extending upward. Koneko, across the room, had set down her book. She was watching him with those gold eyes that were doing the complex mathematics again. Transfer it, Rias said. Like we practiced. On the dummy. There was a practice dummy at the far end of the training ground, stone, built to take substantial damage, scarred from what appeared to have been decades of someone practicing increasingly ambitious techniques on it. Issei had spent 2 evenings learning to direct the boosted gear's output at a target rather than holding it internally. He was middling at it. He pointed his arm at the dummy, felt for the mechanism of transfer. Transfer, said Drake. The beam went wide by about 4 feet and hit the wall instead, which cracked. Better than last time, Kiba said encouragingly. Last time it had hit the ceiling. Much better, said Rias, whose expression was doing something complicated that might have been suppressed amusement. Again. From the beginning, they trained for 2 hours. By the end of the first hour, Issei's aim had improved enough that he was hitting the dummy more often than not. By the end of the second, he could do 5 consecutive boosts and transfer without losing direction, which Rias told him was faster progress than she'd expected and which she said without inflection but which he'd learned by now meant she was actually impressed. He was also exhausted in a way that was interesting, not physically depleted. Not in the way a workout depletes muscles, more like the feeling of having used a muscle he'd never consciously used before. A deep structural tiredness from somewhere in him that was learning to carry a load it had always theoretically had the capacity for but had never been asked to actually lift. He sat on the training ground floor with his back against the wall and drank the water Akeno brought him and felt Drake's quiet satisfaction radiating up through the gauntlet like warmth from a stone that has been in the sun all day. You're doing well, Drake said. Privately, now, not projecting to the room, just speaking into the space between the gem and Issei's ear in the way that felt like thinking rather than hearing. Better than well. What you carry amplifies the boosted gear's base function in ways that I am still. A small pause, which from Drake felt significant. Drake was not, typically, a pausing kind of presence. Mapping. What do you mean? Issei asked, quietly enough that only Drake could hear. Or he thought only Drake could hear. Koneko, 3 feet away, glanced at him without turning her head. The boosted gear doubles power, Drake said. That is its function. What you carry, another pause. Doubles implies a baseline. Implies a ceiling that the doubling approaches. The baseline of a normal sacred gear user is finite. Measurable. The doubling eventually reaches a limit, where the system stabilizes at a plateau. Issei waited. Your baseline, Drake said carefully, is not finite. I am attempting to calculate it. I have been attempting to calculate it for 9 days. I have not found the bottom of it. A beat. I have also not found the top. Issei stared at the practice dummy, which had a fresh crack in it from his last transfer. Oh, he said. Yes, said Drake, in the tone of a very old dragon who has seen a great many things in a very long time and is looking at something that surprises him anyway. That is approximately my assessment also. The rating game practice session was Kiba's idea. Or rather, Kiba had mentioned that a formal rating game was coming up, a practice match against another peerage structured and refereed, which served as both training and official record, and Rias had decided that Issei should observe it first, participate minimally, get a sense of the mechanics before being dropped into actual competition, which was sensible. Which Issei agreed with. The problem was that the opposing peerage's queen decided, within the first 15 minutes of the practice session, that the most efficient strategy was to neutralize Issei immediately because something about him made her magical sensory equipment produce readings that her brain was filing under. Deal with this first. Her name was Seraphal. No, that wasn't right. Rias had introduced her as Seraphal's representative, a high-level devil named Carlamine, and she was fast. Very fast. She crossed the practice field in the time it took Issei to register that she was moving, and her sword was already at the ready by the time she reached him. New member, she said, sizing him up. You're the anomaly they've been talking about. I've been called worse, Issei said. She swung. He blocked. Barely. The impact ran up his arm and into his shoulder, and he staggered but he didn't fall, and the boosted gear flared automatically, boost, and his feet found purchase and he held. Carlamine looked at his arm with the expression of someone who has just hit something and gotten unexpected data. Interesting, she said, and swung again. The second exchange was worse. She was faster than him, more experienced than him, had a century of combat training behind her, and a devil body that was built for this in ways his was emphatically not. He took a hit that spun him around, took another that knocked him off his feet, landed on the training ground floor on one knee with the boosted gear burning up his arm. Boost, said Drake, keeping pace without being asked. He got up. She hit him again. He got up again. From across the field he could hear Rias calling something, a strategy instruction, a directive. But the blood was loud in his ears and the impact had rattled his focus loose from everything except the immediate problem of the woman in front of him who was very good at hitting him. He got up a third time. His knee was bleeding through his school uniform. He was moderately furious. This was, it turned out, the relevant factor. He wasn't frightened. He wasn't despairing. He wasn't in the transcendent state of selfless sacrifice or righteous fury that typically triggered transformations of the dramatic variety. He was just annoyed, specifically and intensely annoyed, with the focused annoyance of someone who has gotten knocked down 3 times and is now categorically refusing to find it acceptable. He got up, and his left arm was burning, and he did not reach for anything deliberately, did not call on anything, did not make any kind of conscious decision. The gauntlet changed. It was not the full juggernaut drive. He understood later, when Rias explained it with hands slightly less steady than usual, that the full juggernaut drive requires a specific emotional catalyst. Despair, the willingness to sacrifice everything, the abandonment of the will to live in exchange for power, and that the recitation of the boosting poem is the verbal key to that lock. He had done none of that. He had simply been annoyed, and the power had responded. What happened was something in between. The gauntlet expanded. Not to the full draconic armor of the juggernaut drive but to something that covered his arm to the elbow and changed in nature, denser, darker. the black vein in the gem spreading outward across the red scales in a pattern that was not organic but mathematical, precise, like a circuit or a formula written in ancient darkness. The green gem shifted color entirely. Red and black. The Ophis signature, unmistakable, the infinite coiling energy, wrapping around the Drake foundation and the great red warmth and holding, all three of them, in a structure that shouldn't have been stable, and was anyway. The air in the entire training ground changed. Carloman stopped. She was a 100-year-old devil with serious combat experience and a well-calibrated threat assessment, and her well-calibrated threat assessment was currently producing an output she had never received before. Stop. Be very still. Do not make sudden movements. Not because she was about to die, because she was standing next to something that didn't know its own size yet, and the space around it had gone the particular quality of the space near a thing that is genuinely, foundationally enormous. That stillness, that depth, that Koneko had described. Silence in the training ground. Everyone had stopped. Issei looked at his arm. The expanded gauntlet looked back at him with its red-black gem. He could feel Drake in it, alert, careful, holding very steady in the particular way of a very experienced sailor feeling a very large wave building under the boat. He could feel the great red pulse, much louder than usual, resonant and vast. He could feel the Ophis stillness, the infinite coil, wrapping the whole thing in a containment that was not a cage, more like a coastline, something that defines an edge without limiting what's behind it. That, said Drake, very carefully, is new. Yeah, Issei said. Issei. Rias's voice. Level. Measured. The voice of someone who is choosing calm the way you choose a tool. Deliberately, because it is the right instrument for the current job. Can you hear me? I can hear you. Are you all right? He did a quick internal inventory. He was not in pain. He was not frightened. The annoyance had dissipated, replaced by something more curious, the feeling of having briefly glimpsed the room through a door that had been closed all his life, not the room itself, just the light underneath. Yeah, he said. I'm fine. I think. Can you bring it back down? He looked at the gauntlet. He thought about the tea on the windowsill. He thought about the library. He thought about Koneko's foot against the leg of the couch. The circuit pattern receded. The gem returned to its normal layered appearance, green with its black vein. The air pressure in the room normalized. The silence held for another 3 seconds. Then Carloman said, to no one in particular, the match is postponed. Rias dismissed the opposing peerage with a diplomacy that Issei could recognize as extraordinary even from his limited context. She did it efficiently and without alarm, the rating game equivalent of telling guests that something had come up, perhaps they could reschedule. So sorry for the inconvenience. And the quality of her composure through that exchange was something he filed away as deeply impressive and also as evidence of what she must have been like to grow up with, to grow up being. When they were gone, she sat down on the training ground floor. This was notable because Rias Gremory did not sit on floors. She sat in chairs, specifically in her chair, the one that faced rooms and had the weight of belonging and authority in its positioning. She sat on the floor with her legs folded to one side and her crimson hair escaping whatever she'd done with it from the exertion of the practice match, and she looked at Issei with those sea-deep eyes and she said, tell me what that felt like. He sat across from her. Annoyed, he said. That's what triggered it. I kept getting knocked down. He paused. I wasn't scared. I wasn't sad. I didn't want to keep being on the floor. Rias absorbed this. The juggernaut drive, she said carefully, is triggered by despair. By the complete willingness to abandon the self in exchange for power. It is one of the most dangerous states a boosted gear user can enter because the trade is literal. You burn yourself, your memories, your will to live, as fuel. The more complete the despair, the more complete the power. The cost is catastrophic. She paused. What you just did was not that. No, Issei agreed. It was something else. She looked at his left arm, at the boosted gear sitting quiet and present in the gauntlet shape. Something that used neither despair nor sacrifice as its fuel. You were angry, specifically and concretely angry, because someone kept knocking you down, and you'd decided you'd had enough of it. A pause. That's a completely different mechanism. Is that bad? Rias was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I don't know yet. I think it might be the opposite of bad. The Juggernaut drive is catastrophic because the cost is the user themselves. Boosted gear users who enter full Juggernaut drive tend not to come back from it as themselves. The power is real, but the price is everything. She looked at him. What you did had no cost. You were annoyed and the power responded, and when you were done being annoyed it receded. No poem, no sacrifice, no deal. A pause. That implies that what you carry doesn't need despair as a key. It has a different door. What door? Yourself, Akeno said. She was sitting against the wall, legs crossed. Tea somehow materialized despite there being no tea service in a training ground. She was watching him with that layered expression that was, he was increasingly certain, her natural state, not performance, just the simultaneous existence of multiple things in her at once, warmth and amusement and something electric, and underneath it all, something very direct. The Juggernaut drive needs you to empty yourself out to work, she said. What you just did seems to need you to be very specifically, very completely yourself. Annoyed. Present. Refusing. She tilted her head. Great Red doesn't despair. Ophis doesn't sacrifice herself. Neither of them would understand the mechanism of the Juggernaut drive because neither of them have ever had a reason to be empty. A small smile. Why would what you carry? The training ground was quiet. Koneko, who had been standing at the edge of the field since the incident, walked over and sat down beside Issei, not across from him, beside him, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, and said, I felt it from over there. The whole time it was happening. She looked at her hands. When it started I thought it was going to be frightening. That's how things that large usually feel. Frightening. A small pause. It wasn't. What was it? Issei asked. She was quiet for a moment, in the manner of someone choosing words with serious care. Like standing outside on a very clear night, she said finally, and looking up and seeing all of it. All the stars, all the distance, all the dark between them. She looked at him. It should be terrifying. The scale of it. But it isn't, because it's just the sky. It's just what the sky actually is if you look. You look and you feel small, and the smallness doesn't hurt because the thing you're small next to is so entirely, fundamentally good that small next to it is fine. A pause. That was what it felt like, standing next to you. The silence that followed was the particular kind that comes after something true has been said in a room, the kind where everyone is letting it settle, where no one wants to immediately start talking over it. Kiba, who had been quiet through the whole conversation, said, well, and then didn't add anything, which was perhaps the most eloquent response available. Rias looked at Issei. In her expression, in those sea-deep eyes, in the set of her jaw, in the quality of her attention, was something that she wasn't naming yet, that she was choosing, consciously, to leave unnamed for now. But it was there. It had been there, he thought, since the beginning, since she'd first sat across from him on the school steps, and asked what he was and listened to the answer with her whole self. We need to understand what you can do, she said. Properly. Not by accident, not because someone annoys you. A pause. Though that is apparently a viable method and I will keep it in mind for emergencies. Issei laughed. It surprised him, a real, full laugh, the kind that comes out before you've decided to let it out. Rias looked at him when he laughed, and something in her expression did a small, involuntary thing. Akeno's smile changed quality. Koneko's shoulder, already almost touching his, moved the final distance and touched. Sorry, he said, catching his breath. It's just, okay, yes. You're right. We need to understand it properly. Tomorrow, Rias said. She stood, collecting herself back into Rias' memory with the ease of long practice. Shoulders, posture, authority, the whole architecture of her. Today has been sufficient for one session. She extended a hand to him. He took it. She pulled him up, and they were briefly close together, her crimson hair between them, and she looked at him with those eyes, and something about the look was longer than a social look, longer than a strategic look, longer than the look of a club president helping a new member to his feet. Then she stepped back. Practical. Present. Tomorrow, she said. We'll do it deliberately. He was walking home alone, or he thought he was alone, when Drake spoke. Partner, yeah, I want to tell you something. About what I am and what you are and what the relationship between those things means now. The street was quiet. Late enough that the school crowd had dispersed, early enough that the evening crowd hadn't started. Issei walked and listened. I was sealed in the boosted gear 10,000 years ago, Drake said. Myself and Albedo both. We fought endlessly. God of the Bible intervened, separated us, put us in separate prisons. I have been inside one sacred gear user after another since then, passing from generation to generation, watching from inside the gem. Giving power. Taking it back. A pause. It has been a long time. I am accustomed to it. I am accustomed to partners who are temporary. Am I temporary? Issei asked. No, Drake said. Immediately, without pause or qualification. You are not. This is what I want to tell you. You are not a vessel that I am passing through. The boosted gear was designed as a cage. My cage, Albedo's cage. The sacred gear system was built to contain us. To use us. To pass us from user to user like equipment. A beat. What you carry has changed the function of the cage. The infinite coil, Ophis, rewrites containment. It is her fundamental nature. She has been rewriting the nature of boundaries since before this universe had edges. The moment her nature entered this system, she undid the cage, Issei said. She undid the cage, Drake confirmed. I am not sealed, partner. Not anymore. I am here because I choose to be here. And I choose to be here because, the pause this time was long, Drake long, which meant it contained the weight of 10,000 years of consideration. Because you are the first partner I have had who is not using the boosted gear. Who is not using me. You simply are, and I am alongside you. And that is a different thing than anything that has existed before. The street was quiet around him. Somewhere nearby, someone's window was open and music was playing, something low and warm, barely audible. Drake, Issei said. Yes. Are you okay? He paused. I mean, after 10,000 years. Are you okay? Another long pause. The great red pulse in his chest kept its vast, steady beat. I am, Drake said finally. I believe I am. And then, with something that sounded, improbably, given that it came from a several thousand-year-old dragon who had been a prisoner for most of his existence, almost like relief, I believe I am considerably better than I was. Issei put his hand over the gem for a moment. It pulsed once, warm, under his fingers. Good, he said. He kept walking. The evening settled in around him, warm and ordinary and full of the specific light that cities make at this hour, soft and gold and slightly unreal, like the world is reminding you of itself. In his arm, the boosted gear was quiet. In his chest, the great red burned steady. Somewhere in the far back of him, the infinite coil was still. He had died 10 days ago. He had come back from it carrying more than he'd understood he was carrying. He had sat in a training ground and accidentally done something that 100-year-old devil had decided warranted postponing a raiding game. He had a club and a chair in a room that smelled like good tea and old stone and something faintly floral. He had a dragon who had been a prisoner for 10 millennia and was now, by his own assessment, considerably better than he had been. He was, he thought, starting to get a sense of the shape of the thing his life was becoming. It was very large. It was very warm. And it was, in all the ways that mattered, his.